In the waning months of World War II, when the thunder gun still echoed across the Pacific and the world trembled between devastation and victory, a quiet story of human tenderness began to unfold in the most unlikely of places. As the Allied forces advanced deeper into Japanese-held territories, they came upon camps that had long been hidden from view, barbed wire enclosures tucked into jungles or abandoned plantations, where forgotten remnants of war languished in silence. These were not camps filled only with enemy soldiers, but with civilians, women, many of them Japanese, who had been swept into the tide of conflict and left behind to suffer its cruelest consequences. They were teachers and typists, nurses and clerks, some wives of soldiers, others volunteers who had followed their nation's call to distant colonies. When Japan's armies began to collapse and its supply lines were severed, these women were abandoned, isolated from the homeland that had once promised them honor and safety. What they received instead was neglect, hunger, and despair. When American troops and medical personnel finally reached one of these camps in 1945, they found a scene that none of their training or experience could have prepared them for. The air itself seemed heavy with sickness and decay. The wooden barracks were half collapsed, the ground muddy and littered with debris. A few thin figures emerged cautiously from the shadows, blinking against the sunlight as though they had not seen the sky in months. They were barefoot, their hair matted and streaked with dust, their faces gaunt and hollow. Their once pristine kimonos or uniforms had long since disintegrated into rags that barely clung to their frail frames. Some had open sores on their arms and legs. Others carried the unmistakable marks of starvation, jutting bones, trembling hands, and sunken eyes that looked more like those of frightened children than hardened enemies. The American soldiers stood still at first, unsure what to do. They had been told to expect prisoners, perhaps defiant or hostile ones, but nothing like this. These were not combatants. They were victims. When the women realized who had arrived, panic swept through them. They had been fed endless propaganda by Japanese officers and guards, who warned that if captured, American soldiers would abuse or kill them. The women fell to their knees, bowing their heads to ground, some weeping, others frozen in terror. A few tried to speak, their voices hoarse from thirst and disuse, but the words were lost between languages. The first American nurse to step forward was a young woman barely in her 20s, her name stitched neatly above her heart on the khaki fabric of her uniform. She carried a medical bag and wore the white armband of the Red Cross. For a moment she simply looked at them, her heart pounding. In training, she had been taught about the duty to heal all wounded, friend or foe alike. But this was something else. She knelt down in front of the nearest woman, who could not stop shaking. The nurse reached into her bag, took out a canteen of clean water, and gently lifted it to the woman's lips. The prisoner hesitated, her cracked mouth trembling, but the nurse nodded softly, urging her to drink. The water spilled down her chin, and she let out a sound, half gasp, half sob, as though her body could not believe that something so simple, so pure, still existed in the world. Around them, the soldiers began unloading supplies from the trucks, crates of rations, blankets, and medicine. The nurses set up a small aid station beneath a makeshift tent, spreading out white sheets on wooden tables, and laying down the first few women who could no longer stand. The nurses worked quickly but with astonishing gentleness, removing lice-ridden clothing, washing wounds, and dressing sores with antiseptic. The prisoners flinched at every touch, their bodies stiff with fear, but slowly they began to realize that the hands moving over them were not cruel. The touch was light, respectful, even tender. The camp fell into a strange hush, broken only by the rustle of fabric, the quiet murmur of the nurses' voices, and the labored breathing of those they tended. One of the American nurses later wrote in her diary that the hardest part of that day was not the filth or the disease, but the eyes of the women, the way they darted, searching, suspicious at first, and then softening as the hours passed. It was as though, she wrote, they had forgotten that people could be kind. For years, these women had known nothing but commands, beatings, and deprivation. To be touched without violence, to be spoken to without shouting, was almost unbearable. Some of them began to cry quietly while being cleaned, their tears mixing with the water as it ran down their backs. They did not understand the English words spoken to them, but they understood the tone, the gentleness, the patience, the compassion. As the sun began to set that first day, the American camp was alive with quiet movement. Cook fires were lit and warm soup was prepared. The Japanese women, too weak to sit upright, were spoon-fed by the same hands that had hours earlier been bandaging wounds on American soldiers. Some of the nurses, unable to communicate through speech, smiled and gestured instead, brushing the women's hair or wrapping them in blankets. The fear that filled the air at first began to fade, replaced by a fragile, wordless understanding. The soldiers, who had come prepared to fight, now found themselves standing guard not over enemies, but over patients, over human beings who had suffered as much from the war as they had themselves. That night, as rain began to fall gently over the camp, one of the American nurses sat outside her tent and listened to the distant sounds of quiet breathing from the women inside. She felt exhausted but strangely peaceful. "We came here to end a war," she wrote later, but it felt for a moment as if we had stumbled into something holier, a place where enemies could become human again. None of them knew then how long the road to recovery would be, or that the simple act of washing a stranger's back could one day become a story of grace told across generations. But in that single moment, beneath a dim canvas tent in a war-torn land, something gentle had survived the fire, something like mercy. The second day dawned gray and humid, a thin mist clinging to the wreckage of the camp. The night had been restless. Some of the rescued women had moaned softly in their sleep, haunted by fever and nightmares. Others had lain awake in silence, afraid to close their eyes lest everything, the blankets, the clean water, the gentle voices, vanished like a dream. When morning came, the American nurses moved quietly among them, checking pulses, refilling canteens, and stirring tins of powdered milk into warm cups. They spoke little, their movements practiced and calm. For the Japanese women, the strangeness of the previous day had not faded. They still watched every gesture with wary eyes, as though expecting that kindness might suddenly turn to cruelty. Yet a small change had begun, an almost invisible softening. The nurses could sense it. Fear was slowly giving way to something like trust, though fragile as a thread. The task that day was hygiene. Most of the prisoners had not bathed properly in months, some in years. Their skin was cracked and covered with layers of grime. Many had lice, infections, and sores that refused to heal. The nurses knew that without washing and disinfecting their bodies, no medicine could truly help them. So they set up a line of makeshift tubs beside the medical tent, heating water over open fires until steam rose gently into the morning air. They carried buckets back and forth, mixing disinfectant and soap, the smell of which, clean, sharp, and unfamiliar, filled the camp. At first, when the women realized what was happening, panic rippled through them again. They whispered among themselves, clutching their tattered clothes, glancing nervously toward the soldiers standing guard nearby. Bathing was private, even sacred, and the thought of being undressed before foreigners, before Americans, filled them with shame. Sensing their fear, the head nurse, a tall woman with calm gray eyes, called the guards to step away. She spoke softly to her team and then began to demonstrate, rolling up her sleeves and dipping a cloth into the warm water. One of the older Japanese women, barely able to stand, was guided gently to a stool beside the tub. The nurse gestured for her permission before touching her shoulder. The woman trembled, her lips pressed tight, but after a long pause she nodded. The nurse began to wash her, moving slowly, carefully, as though afraid that too much pressure might cause pain. The water darkened as it ran down the woman's back, carrying away months of dirt and despair. At first, she sat stiffly, her body rigid. Then her shoulders began to shake. The nurse froze, thinking she might be in pain, but the woman turned her face away and began to sob, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to rise from somewhere far inside her. The sound filled the tent. The other women watched in stunned silence. They had seen each other cry before, from hunger, from loss, but never like this. There was something different in these tears, something that had nothing to do with fear. The nurse placed a hand lightly on the woman's shoulder and continued washing, her own eyes blurring. Soon, another nurse began to do the same for a younger girl whose hair was so tangled that it took nearly an hour to comb through. As the warm water touched her skin, she too began to cry, whispering words that the nurses did not understand. One of them, A Japanese-American interpreter who had arrived with the medical unit leaned in to listen. Between sobs, the girl kept repeating a single phrase over and over again, "Tengdekuda, Tengdekuda." The interpreter felt her throat tighten. She turned to the others and murmured, "She's saying, 'This is heaven.'" The word spread quietly among the nurses. None of them spoke for a moment. The camp, once filled with the groans of sickness and the clatter of boots, now seemed utterly still except for the gentle rhythm of water and the sound of weeping. Some of the American nurses cried too, unable to hold back the emotion of that moment. They had tended to the dying on battlefields, watched their own soldiers bleed and beg for life, seen horrors that would follow them forever, but nothing had pierced them quite like this. The realization that the simplest act of human care, the washing of another's back, could undo years of hate. The washing continued for hours. The women came one by one, timidly at first, and then willingly, as if drawn by the sight of others emerging from the tents wrapped in clean sheets, their faces radiant despite exhaustion. Some clasped the nurses' hands afterward, bowing deeply, their tears falling onto the nurses' sleeves. They had lived for so long under fear, indoctrinated to believe that Americans were monsters, only to find that their supposed enemies were treating them with compassion beyond anything they had known from their own captors. For the nurses, it was equally humbling. They had lost brothers, fiancés, and friends of the war. Many had come to the Pacific carrying silent anger toward the Japanese, an anger born of grief. But now, kneeling in the mud beside women who had suffered in different but parallel ways, they felt that hatred slipping away like dirt in water. By late afternoon, the tubs were nearly empty, the fires dying down to embers. The camp was transformed. The once fetid smell of disease was replaced by the faint scent of soap and steam. The women lay resting in clean clothes, their hair neatly combed, their skin no longer pale with filth, but warm with blood returning to the surface. The nurses moved among them quietly, adjusting blankets, checking bandages, and offering small smiles. It was not victory they felt. It was something far gentler, something they could not quite name. The interpreter, sitting outside the tent as the sun dipped behind the trees, wrote a single line in her notebook. "Today I learned that mercy speaks every language." That night, as darkness fell over the camp, many of the Japanese women could not sleep. They lay awake under the thin blankets, touching their freshly washed skin, whispering to one another in disbelief. "This is heaven." They repeated softly in the dark, not as a phrase of exaggeration, but as truth. After years of cruelty, of being forgotten, they had at last felt the warmth of another human's kindness, and it was enough to make even hell fade for a while. The following days passed in a rhythm that felt almost sacred. The chaos of war seemed to recede beyond the barbed wire, replaced by something quieter, more human. The camp that had once been a place of despair now echoed with new sounds. The soft laughter of women speaking in hushed voices, the clinking of tin cups, the rustle of sheets drying in the sun. It was as if the world outside, still raging with gunfire and politics, had no claim on this small patch of earth where compassion had taken root. The American nurses moved tirelessly through their rounds, treating wounds, distributing food, and helping the women regain their strength. Many of the prisoners had been on the brink of death when they were found, but now their eyes began to brighten, their cheeks filling out little by little. They were fragile, yes, but alive, and aware that the life returned to them came from the hands of those they had once been taught to hate. The nurses, too, were changing. In the first days after liberation, their mission had been purely medical. Stabilize, cleanse, feed, and move on. But as they came to know the women they were caring for, the work ceased to feel like duty and began to feel like redemption. There was something deeply personal in the way they lifted each frail body from the ground, wrapped trembling shoulders in blankets, or spoon-fed thin mouths. They began learning small Japanese words, mizu for water, daijobu for okay, namuru for sleep. Simple syllables that carried enormous tenderness when spoken aloud. And when the women smiled shyly or whispered arigato, the nurses felt something in their hearts ease, something that had been knotted tight for years of war. One of the nurses, a red-haired woman named Margaret, had lost her brother on a Pacific island less than a year before. She had arrived full of anger, still raw from grief, believing that helping the enemy was an act of duty, but never forgiveness. Yet one afternoon, as she sat washing the feet of an elderly Japanese nurse who had once worked in a military hospital in Manila, she caught herself smiling. The older woman's hands were shaking as she tried to thank her, tears rolling down her hollow cheeks. Margaret realized, with a sudden clarity that left her breathless, that this woman might have been caring for wounded men just like her brother, men who had also been young and afraid, caught in a war neither side had truly chosen. For the first time, Margaret saw not an enemy, but another nurse, another soul who had suffered in the same cruel tide of history. Later, she would write in her journal, "I thought I came here to heal bodies, but it is my heart that is being healed." Throughout the camp, similar moments unfolded quietly. A young Japanese girl, no more than 17, who had once worked as a typist for an army officer, began helping the nurses translate simple instructions for the other women. Her English was halting, but her eagerness to assist bridged the gap between the two worlds. The Americans started calling her Little Star because her real name, Hoshiko, meant just that. She would blush each time they said it, and used to being treated as something precious. Another woman, older and frail, spent hours folding bandages neatly, insisting that she wanted to contribute in any way she could. When one of the nurses tried to stop her, fearing she was too weak, the woman shook her head firmly and said in broken English, "Work good. Alive again." The words brought tears to everyone who heard them. The nurses began to see how the smallest gestures, sharing a piece of bread, brushing someone's hair, sitting together in silence, had power greater than any medicine. The Japanese women, who had been stripped of dignity and identity for so long, began to reclaim both through these acts of care. They would line up patiently for meals, bowing slightly in gratitude. Some started humming songs from home, soft melodies that drifted to the camp like the scent of distant blossoms. A few even laughed, tentatively at first, as if testing whether joy was still allowed. The American soldiers who guarded the perimeter often watched from a distance, bewildered. Many had lost friends in combat and carried their own bitterness. But seeing the women once viewed as the enemy, now smiling and holding hands with American nurses, something shifted inside them too. It was impossible not to feel moved by the sight. One evening, a soldier brought a small radio into the camp and played a slow, sentimental tune. To everyone's surprise, a few of the women began to sway gently to the rhythm, their thin forms illuminated by the orange glow of the fire. The nurses joined them, laughing softly, and for a brief moment, there were no sides, no uniforms, only people, weary and alive, sharing a fragment of peace. The interpreter, the same young woman who had translated, "This is heaven," wrote a letter home that night. "It is strange," she said, "how easily war teaches us to hate, and how quickly kindness can make us forget." She described how the women would reach out to touch the nurses' hands before sleeping, as though to reassure themselves that the miracle of gentleness was real. "I have seen battlefields," she wrote, "but I have never seen anything as powerful as a warm hand." As the days turned into weeks, the women grew stronger. Some began walking around the camp, helping the nurses with chores, or tending to the small vegetable patch that had been planted behind the medical tent. They were still haunted by the past, the faces of lost husbands, the memories of hunger and fear, but life was seeping back into them, quiet and steady. The Americans arranged for photographs to be taken, both for records and to show proof of their recovery. In one image, a group of the women stand together, freshly washed and smiling faintly at the camera, while behind them an American nurse adjusts a blanket on one of their shoulders. It is a simple picture, but to those who were there, it captured something indescribable. The moment when enemies became sisters in suffering, bound by the fragile grace of compassion. And yet, even as the camp grew brighter each day, a heavy truth lingered in the air. Soon, they would have to part ways. The war was ending, and the world beyond was waiting to reclaim them. But before that separation came, something deeper would take root, a quiet understanding that would live long after uniforms were folded away and nations rebuilt themselves. In that small corner of a ruined world, both the givers and receivers of mercy had discovered the same thing, that humanity, once lost, could be found again not through victory, but through kindness. Weeks turned into months, and the one silent camp had become almost unrecognizable. The mud paths were now lined with drying clothes. the tents clean and orderly, the air filled with a faint murmur of voices that no longer trembled with fear. The Japanese women, though still thin and weak in body, had begun to carry themselves differently. They stood a little taller, spoke a little louder, and even smiled without shame. Their faces, once pale and hollow, now bore the subtle warmth of people who had been allowed to feel human again. The American nurses, who had arrived hardened by years of war and exhaustion, found themselves changed too. They still wore their uniforms and carried their duties with discipline. But the war seemed to have loosened its grip on their hearts. Something in that camp, something fragile and wordless, had softened them in ways no one could predict it. Every morning, the nurses and the women worked side by side. They cleaned, cooked, and nursed those still too sick to move. The boundaries between them, between victor and vanquished, nurse and patient, had quietly dissolved. They had become a kind of family, born not of blood or nation, but of shared survival. The Americans taught the women to make bread using military rations, and in return, the Japanese women showed them how to prepare rice properly, rinsing it until the water ran clear. Laughter returned, quiet but genuine. The nurses began to learn their names: Hoshiko, Akemi, Keiko, Sayaka. Each name carried a story of lost homes, missing husbands, and lives interrupted, but also of endurance. Then one morning, word came from the Allied command that the women were to be transferred. The war had ended. Japan had surrendered. The camps would be dismantled, and arrangements made to send the civilians home. The news was met with both joy and sorrow. The women gathered together, some in disbelief that the nightmare was finally over, others crying softly, because leaving meant parting from the nurses who had become their saviors and sisters. The Americans, too, struggled to contain their emotions. They had seen death so often that they had almost forgotten what it meant to feel attachment. But now, the thought of goodbye felt like another kind of wound. On the last day, the camp was unusually still. Trucks lined the dusty road, engines idling softly, ready to carry the women to the port. The nurses helped them pack the few belongings they had, mostly donated clothes, blankets, and small tokens the Americans had given them: a comb, a hand mirror, a photograph. Some women carried folded letters written in English they couldn't yet read, notes from the nurses wishing them peace and safety. One of the nurses had drawn a small red cross beside her name, so that even if the words were lost in translation, the symbol of care would remain. Before the departure, a quiet ceremony took place near the edge of the camp. It was not planned, not official, just a spontaneous gathering. The women stood in a semicircle. Faces turned toward the nurses, who stood opposite them in their faded khaki uniforms. No one spoke at first. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the scent of salt from the distant sea. Then one of the older Japanese women stepped forward. Her hands were thin, her back slightly bent, but her eyes shone with strength. She bowed deeply, and when she raised her head, she said in halting English, "You angels, you make us live again." Her voice broke, and she pressed her hands together in gratitude. The interpreter translated for those who couldn't understand, but even without words, the meaning was clear. Tears filled many eyes. Another woman, Hoshiko, the young typist the nurses had called Little Star, stepped forward next. She held a small folded paper crane, delicate and white, made from a page torn from a medical supply box. She placed it in the hand of the head nurse and whispered in Japanese, "So you remember us?" The nurse nodded, unable to speak. Around them, other women began to weep softly, their tears no longer from fear or despair, but from a sorrow too beautiful to describe, the sorrow of parting from those who had shown them the meaning of compassion. When the trucks finally started, the nurses stood in silence, their hands raised in farewell. The Japanese women waved from the back of the vehicles, their faces streaked with tears. Some called out in broken English, "Thank you, thank you," their voices echoing until distance swallowed the sound. As the last truck disappeared down the road, a quiet stillness fell over the camp. The nurses stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle, feeling the emptiness left behind. They had witnessed so much suffering during the war that they thought their hearts had hardened beyond repair. But in that place, amid ruin and recovery, they had discovered that kindness could still grow, even out of the ashes. Years later, many of those nurses would write about that time. Some kept journals. Others spoke in interviews long after the war. Again and again, they returned to the same memory. The day they washed the backs of Japanese women and heard them whisper through tears, "This is heaven." They said it was the moment that reminded them why they had become nurses, why mercy mattered more than victory. For the Japanese women, too, the memory never faded. When they returned to Japan, they told their families of the American nurses who had treated them with tenderness, who had touched them without judgment. For them, that brief time in the camp became a sacred story, a reminder that even in war, goodness could exist. Some decades later, one of the surviving nurses visited Japan as an old woman. She was invited to a small gathering of war survivors, where a frail Japanese woman approached her, walking slowly with a cane. When their eyes met, the nurse recognized her instantly. It was Hoshiko, Little Star. Time had aged them both, but the memory between them was still alive. Without hesitation, the woman reached into her bag and produced a tiny yellowed paper crane. She held it up and smiled. "You remember," she said softly in English. The nurse took her hands and whispered, "Always." In that moment, surrounded by peace that neither could imagine all those years ago, they stood together not as nurse and prisoner, not as American and Japanese, but as two souls bound forever by the simplest, most sacred truth, that mercy is stronger than hate, and that a single act of compassion can echo across generations. The words once spoken in a trembling voice beneath a canvas tent, "This is heaven," had proven true, not because of angels or miracles, but because for one brief, shining moment in the ruins of war, humanity had remembered itself.